Hello, and welcome to the Erin's Law Instruction During Distance Learning webinar for parents and caregivers. I'm Angie Foster Lawson. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm the Sexuality Education Analyst at the Oregon Department of Education. During this unprecedented time of physical distancing and school closures due to coronavirus or COVID-19, sexuality and health education are increasingly important. This webinar will provide support to parents and caregivers surrounding instruction in the area of child abuse prevention and sexual violence prevention in a distance learning for all format. Before we get into how your family can support Erin's Law instruction, we want to remind you that student, family, and community, physical and emotional well-being come first. Learning only happens when children and young people feel healthy, safe, and secure. Be patient with yourself and your family. This is new for everyone. Take care of your own and your family's emotional and health needs during this time. If any of your family is sick, that is the number one priority, not at-home learning. During this webinar, we will explain why sexuality and health education is so important during distance learning. We'll review which topics are covered in Erin's Law instruction, and we'll answer questions that parents and caregivers often have about Erin's Law. We may refer to this content in a few ways, so we're going to explain why. Erin's Law, or Senate Bill 856, is one fundamental component of our sexuality education law, which is OAR 588-022-2050. This requires 4 sessions of child abuse prevention instruction every year, grades K to 12. It also requires that instruction be age-appropriate, medically accurate, and not fear or shame-based. Child abuse prevention is part of a larger goal of violence prevention, and both of these are major goals of sexuality education. Sexuality education is also nestled within health education, which is why health and sexuality education standards live together in one place. We want to provide context for why we believe sexuality and health education is so important, especially during this time of school closures and physical distancing. Sexuality education supports young people with skills to delay sexual initiation, prevent unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections, develop healthy friendships and relationships, and reduce sexual violence, harassment, and bullying. Sexuality education also creates supportive and inclusive environments for LGBTQ+ identifying students in order to decrease negative mental health outcomes and bullying based on identity. In order to accomplish these goals, we must first build a foundation of priority topics that aligns with the Oregon Health Education Standards and our comprehensive sexuality education law, which includes requirements for Erin's Law. These topics listed here are foundational to the prevention and response of abuse, violence, and bullying, as proven by research and best practices in the fields of violence prevention and sexuality education. When woven together year after year through health and sexuality education, students learn skills to build resiliency, understand bodily autonomy of self and others, and practice advocacy for safe and inclusive classroom environments for all students. So how can parents and caregivers support Erin's Law instruction? We believe and celebrate at the Oregon Department of Ed that parents and caregivers are the first and primary sexuality educators to all Oregon students, which is to say, you've already been supporting it. Our goal as a state is to help support school districts to partner with you in providing sexuality education that aligns to our laws to nurture health and well-being for every student. While we know this is a very difficult time for families and caregivers, it is also a real opportunity for open communication and values sharing about health and sexuality related topics between students and families. We're hoping that we can give you some information so you feel more prepared in having some of these conversations with the students in your lives if you're able to do so. First, consider what is your ability to help students participate in Erin's Law lessons. It would be inequitable to assume every family has the same capacity for facilitating distance learning right now. If you are able to support students in reaching the full lesson content, that's great. For those families, you can help facilitate access to Erin's Law lessons that your district provides. If you are unable to engage in distance learning for all for any reason, please know that your district's first priority is to your family's health and well-being. Districts will work with students to fill in any potential gaps in learning from extended school closure during the next school year. That being said, even families unable to engage in distance learning may find ways to integrate conversations and skills practice for health and sexuality education topics into their daily routines. Some ways you can do this are watching a short sexuality education video together. Some examples of these are on amaze.org, which can help get conversations started and are usually a very low time commitment. They also have a section dedicated to helping parents and caregivers start these conversations. You could listen to a podcast together, like 6-Minute Sex Ed, which covers age-appropriate sexuality education topics and is family-friendly, dividing episodes into Level 1 for younger listeners and Level 2 for more complex topics for older students. The third suggestion is to prompt conversations that cover Erin's Law topics, whether or not you can help facilitate full lessons with your students. Health and sexuality are all around us. In case you need some ideas for what kinds of topics you could focus on, we have a few to share. You'll notice that most contain specific but open-ended questions that can't be answered with a simple yes or no. The first, what are some examples of healthy relationships you see? What does it look like when a relationship is healthy and makes all people involved feel good? Be specific. So you'll see some examples below this of how your student could relate to this. It could be friendships, it could be relationships they see in movies or TV they're watching, sibling relationships, relationships between parents and caregivers and the children, relationships between or the parents and caregivers themselves, and other family members are just some examples of how they could relate to this content, no matter what age. Another question they could think about is, what is a personal boundary? What is consent? Brainstorm all the ways boundaries and consent show up in your daily routine. We know that folks are dealing with lots of different circumstances during physical distancing precautions, and so that might bring up a lot of natural connections to drawing some new boundaries and understanding how we can potentially get privacy when we ask for it. What makes each family member feel good and loved during this time of distance learning? How can you help support each other in feeling a little bit better? This, of course, is so important to think about right now because we know this is such a stressful time for so many Oregonians. And the last conversation starter we have to consider is, what does it feel like to be bullied or harassed in person or online? For example, on social media, texting, video calls, or even during virtual learning. What can you do when that happens? The next question we're going to consider is, how do I know this content is age appropriate? Oregon laws and education standards require that all content is age appropriate. Age appropriate means that curricula are responsive to the changing needs and capabilities of children and young people as they grow. Based on the age and development of learners, sexuality education addresses relevant topics when it is most timely for their health and well-being. Oregon standards are grade-specific and reflect the most current research as well as the National Health Education Standards. What if you don't know what to say when your child asks you a sexuality-related question? Here are some tips to answering questions and having conversations with children and young adults about sexuality and growing up. The first tip is, it's always okay to say you don't know and that you'll get back with them. Even the most seasoned sexuality educators had to do a lot of practice to get comfortable talking about these topics and using medically accurate words to do so. You can always use this strategy to take some time to check in with your family's values, do some research, and review their Erin's Law lessons for more context before answering. In taking this time to think first, you're actually modeling for kids that adults don't always have the answers, and we have to find accurate sources for information just like they will have to. Just be sure you do follow up eventually, or your child may interpret your silence as unwillingness to have these conversations at all. The next tip is, start slow. If you aren't sure how much information to give, start with a simple answer and ask, did that answer your question? Often younger children may be curious about a very simple aspect of growing up and be overwhelmed when a well-meaning adult offers a very long and technical explanation. If you are able, review the materials they are getting for distance learning so you have an understanding about the scope of what they may ask. And the final tip is check in often. You wouldn't have just one talk about any other skills-based learning, like driving a car, cooking a meal, or learning to read, and expect children or young adults to have all the information they need on that skill set in just one talk. This means you'll have to check in often. Even if it doesn't seem like students want to talk about sexual health, they will be better prepared to make healthy and thoughtful decisions if they know they can talk to trusted adults in their lives about it. If you don't have these conversations and they never get any health education in school, research shows they will seek often inaccurate and harmful information on the internet and through the media and search for these answers instead. What if you're worried about sexuality education providing information that does not align with your family's values? The goal of sexuality education is to provide factual information aligning to our state laws about sexuality and health for young people. We train teachers and districts to present the range of values alongside facts when teaching, and then we recommend that students speak with a trusted adult to discuss more about their familial, cultural, or faith-based values. That being said, one benefit families have during this time of at-home learning is the opportunity to speak openly about values as the learning is happening. Lastly, we recommend 100% transparency for districts and schools when it comes to sex ed. This means notification to families about any and all sexuality education lessons, access to review the lessons and content if requested, and offering the legal right to opt your child or student out of certain lessons. Districts are required to choose materials for their schools that meet our health education standards and our sexuality education laws. What if your question wasn't answered in this webinar? We're always here for you. If you would like a list of all possible Erin's Law resources for your family, or if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach us, Sasha Grenier at sasha.grenier@state.or.us or Angie Foster Lawson at angie.foster-lawson@state.or.us. Also know that your school district is working hard to ensure that your students are getting what they need to participate in distance learning. Get in touch with them if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your partnership and engagement in supporting child abuse prevention and sexual violence prevention with Erin's Law instruction. We're wishing you all health and wellness.